Hey, everybody, we're back again with Paul Craig Roberts to talk about the freeing of Julian Assange after so many years of being persecuted. And some people called it prosecution, but it was really a persecution. And Paul, what does this mean overall in terms of the First Amendment, freedom of the press, and our right to know what the government is doing?
Well, I'm not sure it means all that much because I think one of the purposes of what was done to Julian Assange was to intimidate the media from publishing leaked information that was unfavorable to Washington. And I think that's been achieved. Uh, you see, Assange was not freed in the sense that the case was abandoned or overturned by a higher court or something. Um, the ordeal of Assange ended when the Justice Department suddenly decided it wanted out for whatever reason, I don't know, and quickly arranged a deal with Assange or his representatives that in exchange for Julian Assange uh, making a plea of guilt to one charge of, I think what was it? I think conspiracy to obtain national security documents. In exchange for that, his sentence would be the time served already in the British jail. Of course, the time he spent there was a violation of habeas corpus because he's never been accused or convicted of a crime, but he's been in jail for 62 months in a maximum security prison in Britain, uh,
Under
despite the fact that there's no charges outstanding and no conviction.
yeah, under horrible conditions.
Horrible conditions, tiny, tiny cell and solitary confinement.
Yeah.
So I think the Justice Department reached the conclusion it had achieved its objectives. It had shown journalists, American journalists or foreign journalists, you see, he's not even an American citizen and somehow is being brought under our law. He's not an American citizen. Our law doesn't apply to him. If Assange, for example, murdered a fellow Australian, we couldn't send out an arrest warrant for him under American law.
Yeah.
So what he does as an Australian is subject to their laws. So he wasn't even in the United States where allegedly he committed this offense.
He was originally charged with treason, which can't apply since he wasn't a citizen.
That's right. They had to change that to
That's
conspiracy to obtain national security documents or
Yeah,
something.
Paul, what strikes me about this, one of the real sad outcomes of this is how he had no support from fellow journalists, from investigative reporters, for those seeking the truth, for those exposing government secrets. Once upon a time, not too long ago, with the Watergate case, the Washington Post and New York Times were printing Daniel Ellsberg's leaked documents and defending him. This is all turned around.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you mean the Pentagon Papers, not Watergate.
I mean the Pentagon Papers. No
Yeah,
support, no support from fellow journalists this time.
yeah, that shows how far we've declined in the 50 years since when was Ellsberg? That's 73 to now. That's 50 years, 51 years. So um, this is a huge decline. Basically, the American media was terminated when the Clinton regime allowed 6 mega corporations to purchase 90% of the media.
Mhm.
So it's all concentrated in a few hands,
Yeah.
and uh, and there's no longer any independent journalism, not in the print and TV areas,
Oh,
only online, and there's less and less online. So there simply aren't any journalists today. I mean, this is the reason they didn't come to his support. Now, to modify that, about a year ago, I think it was, uh, a small handful of newspapers, including the New York Times, came out in defense of Assange and says this should be dropped. Now, why it took them 12 years to do this, I don't know. I did read the statement they made, and they did make a statement, but you haven't seen emphasis on it. It's not something they're repeating and saying and saying. And also, about the same time, or maybe 2 years ago, the Australian government, which had never supported Assange, all of a sudden started pressuring Washington to drop the charges. So whether it was a change in the nature of the Australian government, the people there got very put out with that prime minister they had that imposed all the COVID mandates on them,
yeah.
and the deadly vax and the mask and all the rest. And I think it led to some change in the government. It may be a government with a different attitude, but that government started putting pressure on Washington. So, but I think as I was saying, what happened was the U.S. had achieved its aim. It intimidated journalists. It had said, this is what happens if you embarrass us in any way. And also, of course, they claim a victory because they got a conviction. He is convicted by his plea agreement.
Yeah.
So they did get a conviction without a trial.
Yeah.
See, how are you going to get a conviction with a trial? I mean, they'll be very careful how they choose the prosecutors and the jury and all that. But still, he hadn't done anything that's not protected. And moreover, he's not an American citizen. So what's he on trial for in the first place? I mean, so I think this is, it met Washington's needs. We got a conviction. We've got rid of this problem, and we've taught the journalists what's going to happen to them if they cross us. So Washington probably sees it as a victory. Now, of course, Assange's supporters see it as a victory for him because he is out of the prison. He's now back in Australia.
Yeah, people were worried that he was on death's door, the way he looked.
Yeah.
And, would he survive any more time in his incarceration? But anyway, Paul, what I want to get at here is what I want to emphasize is the import of this, the impact of this, the chilling effect it's going to have. Now, during the Pentagon Papers, Daniel Ellsberg was a government employee who leaked the documents. And I think he was originally charged, as he could be by law, because a government employee and he in effect stole documents. But those charges were dropped or just went away. But the publication of it now was allowed. The New York Times and the Washington Post. So in other words, back then, as a journalist, you could receive stolen, leaked documents from a government official, and you could publish it without being prosecuted. But with Assange, that's changed that equation now, that if you merely publish leaked documents, you're vulnerable too. So that's really a chilling effect on the watchdog role of the press and the First Amendment.
Right. And that was the purpose of the prosecution or persecution of Assange. That was the whole purpose. It was to intimidate journalists. not just ours, but journalists anywhere, because Assange was in Europe and he's an Australian citizen. Later, he was an Ecuadorian citizen as well,
Yeah.
because of the asylum that the president at that time had given him. So, and it has other frightening aspects. You have to remember that when the president of Ecuador, who granted him asylum and citizenship, when he departed office, his successor was approached by Washington and paid or given, the country was given billions in loans, which Washington let the president know could go into his pocket as far as they were concerned, in exchange for taking away Assange's asylum and citizenship. And that's how the British got their hands on him. When the new president of Ecuador was bribed by Washington to retract Assange's asylum, into the embassy went the British police and dragged him out. And then we used Britain for 62 months as Assange's jailer. So we were able to keep him in prison for what, 5 years, 2 months, while the British courts went through the rigmarole of holding a hearing on whether or not to extricate him to America. And then they would rule, yes, he can be extricated. And then Assange would appeal. And then the appeal would go on for a year. And then they would rule again, yes, he can be extricated. And then he would appeal again. And the appeal would go on. And so they used this to keep him in jail for 62 months. And if you add together the time he was in effect in prison in the embassy in London, he couldn't leave the embassy. And before that, he was under house arrest in England. They stole 13 years of his life, 13 years of his wife's life, 13 years of his children's life, by using all of these rigmaroles to keep him locked up. And still no charges, just a request for indictment, for extradition.
Now, the person who provided him with the documents was Chelsea Manning. And he was imprisoned, I think, for 7 years, but his sentence was commuted by Obama. So, he got a different treatment, and he was the one who leaked the documents. And Assange is the one who merely published them, and look what happened to him. So, it's again.
Manning didn't do anything that Ellsberg didn't do.
Right, right. They claim that that it was a conspiracy, and that he was coached to release the documents by Assange. But you're saying we no evidence of that.
There's no evidence, but this is a charge made not against Manning, but against Assange.
Right.
This was the hook into Assange, because they were saying, well, he didn't just publish leaked documents. He conspired with Manning to access and steal them.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, Manning already had the documents. We know for a fact that Manning had the documents. He was in U.S. intelligence, and he presented them to his own commanders and said, look, we've committed this war crime. We've shot these journalists down in the streets. We've shot down anybody who stopped to help them. This is a war crime. You have to do something about it. It is required by the regulations of the United States Army. It's your responsibility. You have to do this. And the authorities, the military authorities, ignored Manning. It was then that he released the documents, but he already had them.
Yeah.
Otherwise, how did he take them to the authorities and demand that they do something about it? So I think the United States government in both cases achieved their goal. They got convictions in both cases.
So
They both,
Go ahead.
And in both cases, they served a number of years in prison. What was worse about Assange is he served the years without conviction. In Manning's case, they first convicted him, then he served. In Assange's case, first he served, then he admits a plea. He's convicted after he served, and his sentence is reduced to time served, and so he's turned loose. In a way, it's worse that he served his time before he was convicted. It shows further collapse in law since Manning's time. And if you go back to Ellsberg's, it's been a huge collapse in the integrity of American law as administered by the U.S. Department of Justice, which I always put after justice, I put in parentheses sick, S-I-C, because there is no such department. I can't think of any justice that comes out of the Justice Department.
I think Lady Justice is blindfolded because she's afraid to see what's going on these days. Paul, thanks once again for your insight, and to be continued as these issues continue to affect the quality of what used to be a protected, constitutionally protected rights in the United States. That picture is changing drastically, so we'll be continuing with this. Paul Craig Roberts, thanks for joining us.